Hello and welcome to this brief introduction to the corporate and business law paper. Although we're looking here specifically at the English paper, what we're going to do is equally applicable to the global paper as well. Now, hopefully as you're aware, there have been significant changes to the F4 paper, and these changes are going to be applicable from August 2014 onwards, which means that if you're going to be sitting the paper version of the exam, the first changes will be evident in December 2014. So the first thing to note with the F4 paper is you can either do it via a computer-based exam, or, as we're going to see here, it can be done via a paper-based exam. And it doesn't really matter which way around you do this, the format of the exam is going to be very, very similar. So as we can see lower down the page on this specimen paper here, the exam is now a 2-hour examination. Previously it was 3 hours with 15 minutes reading time. You're going to have two sections in the exam, Section A and Section B, and note that all of the questions are still compulsory, so there's no element of choice in this particular paper. The first 45 questions are going to be what we call objective test questions, and that's going to be a mixture of multiple choice questions, multiple response questions, and perhaps something called a multiple response matching question. And then what we've got in the second part are 5 questions, and as we'll see, these are slightly longer questions where you'll have a longer scenario, and each of those will have 6 marks available. And those 6 marks will typically be split across 3 requirements, and each of those requirements will relate back to the single longer scenario. So looking here briefly at your typical Section A questions, as we said, there will be 45 questions in total. Of those 45 questions, 25 of them will be worth 2 marks and 20 of them will be worth 1 mark. What differentiates a 2-mark answer from a 1-mark answer is typically here you'll have to make a selection out of 4 possible answers, and here you're going to have to make a choice out of 3 possible answers. So you can see here question 1 in this particular exam, which of the following may imply terms into a contract. You've got a choice A, B or C. We move on to question 2 in the exam. We've got here which of the following would normally participate in surplus capital. Well, this is now a 2-mark question, so therefore you have a choice out of 4 questions. And as we mentioned earlier, there's going to be a combination of your bog standard multiple choice question, as we've got here. So can I make a choice out of the correct answers available? Some of the questions will what we call a multiple response question. So in this particular case here, you're asked which 2 of the following are recognised phases in money laundering. Now the ACCA have been quite clear on this. Where you get a multiple response question, you will be told how many of the responses are correct. And in F4 we would expect you to be given a list of 4 possible options, and you would normally be asked to select which 2 of those. There isn't any negative marking per se, so if you get the answers wrong you won't lose marks, but you have to get both of the correct answers highlighted in order to score any credit. So if you only get part of the answer correct, so if you correctly identify one answer but not the other, you will get 0 marks. You can see there's another example underneath here. Again, another multiple response question, which 2 of the following, and it's 2 marks, and you either get 2 marks or you get 0 marks. So that's Section A of the exam. Section B is going to have 5 questions, each of them worth 6 marks, and typically, but not always, it'll be broken down into 3 2-mark requirements, and these requirements can be a combination of multiple choice or multi-response, or potentially something called multi-response matching, where you'll be given answers in a box and you have to tick which box belongs to which sort of question stem. So we've got a typical sort of example here. So we've got a short scenario, and then below we've got our 3 questions. Now if you're doing this on a computer-based exam, there will always be multiple choice and multiple response answers here, so naturally you'll have to tick, or you'll have to put a little circle in the box of the answer that you agree with. If you're doing the paper-based exam, then you could be asked, as we've got here, to produce some short written answers. And as we'll see in a moment, if you're doing the paper-based exam, what you really have to be is very concise. So you can imagine if there are only 2 marks available, then typically you're going to have to make 2 legal observations, so 2 legal principles, 2 legal facts, and in order to answer those you don't need to produce a long sort of flowing answer. So bearing in mind the new structure of the exam then, what are the key skills that we think you need in order to be successful in this particular paper? Well, when you get into your talk notes, you'll find at the beginning something called a skills bank. And the skills bank is really a summary of the things that we think you need to be able to do well in order to be successful in this particular exam. So we've got an overview here, and then behind this you'll find several pages giving more advice, more illustrations and examples, etc. But clearly, in a knowledge paper like law, there's going to be a heavy premium on whether or not you can learn the law. So if you read through the next few pages of the skills bank, you'll see some illustrations on how perhaps things like mind maps might help you sort of form mental associations that are going to help you memorize the law. Clearly, you need to be able to manage your time properly, and I guess the thing to remember in a multiple choice exam, especially if you're doing it on a computer, is that there's no negative marking. So if you absolutely have to, if you've only got 5 minutes left in the exam and there are 3 or 4 questions you're uncertain on, you just have to go back and be prepared to make what you feel is an educated guess. Hopefully we're not going to be guessing in the exam, so hopefully we can apply some techniques, and there are some specific techniques available to help you with multiple choice questions. So objective test questions, so it's a combination of multiple choice, multiple response matching, and then there's some more specific advice on how to tackle those longer questions that give you a scenario, especially if you're writing your answer, and some advice on how to keep your answers nice and concise. So that's the exam itself then, so that's what you have to do in order to pass. We'll just have a brief chat about the structure of the syllabus. So the syllabus is summarised quite nicely here. As you can see, there are 8 parts of the syllabus, A, B, all the way down to part H, but what the ACCA haven't done is really applied any percentages. So we can't say this is worth 10%, this is worth 20%, this is worth 40%, etc. But what you can do in terms of guidance is take a quick look at the specimen paper. So from the specimen paper, we can kind of infer that the essential elements of the legal system appears to be worth around about 10%. The law of obligations, and by this we mean contract law, contract formation, breach of contract, damages, as well as the tort of negligence, well, this appears to have a much higher weighting. So we've got, as you can see there, 30 marks overall, so clearly quite an important area of the syllabus. Employment law, a little bit like essential elements of the legal system, 10 marks available, so it looks as though it's around about 10% of the syllabus. How to form a company and your options for different company types, or perhaps you would prefer to run a partnership, looks here as though it's around about sort of 14-15% of the syllabus. If you choose to run a company, you've got to make some decisions over the amount of share capital or loans that you want to take out, and you've got to bear in mind the restrictions on companies' abilities to pay dividends in the capital maintenance chapter. Well, as we can see here, again, looks as though it's around about 10% of the syllabus. Then got a couple of chapters on how to run a company. So we look at the role of the directors and the company secretary, and then we look at the meetings and resolutions that are used to manage the affairs of the company. Well, you can see there around about 10 to 12 marks. Then insolvency, we'd expect either a couple, I think, of sort of 2 or 1 mark questions, or perhaps in some exams we might get a multiple test question for 6 marks for insolvency. And then finally, corporate, fraudulent and criminal behaviour, again, looks as though it's about 10% of the marks. So what we can see is that the marks are spread around all of the different parts of the syllabus, and the only real inference we can take away from this, other than the fact that we have to learn everything, is that each area appears to be worth around about 10% of the marks, which clearly gives us our 80%. And then the other 20% appears to come from formation of a contract, contract breakdown, and the tort of negligence. Well, that concludes our introductions to the paper. What you now need to do is to move on to learning law, and you can do that with the aid of the multiple presentations available on this website. Best of luck with your studies.